Everybody, welcome back into the Phillip Jordan Sports Podcast. Joining me on the show today is Barry McKnight, voice of the Troy Trojans. Also, can listen to them Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. on Sports Radio 740 in Montgomery. And Barry, I really appreciate you taking time coming on the show.
Oh, I appreciate it. You and I have podcasted before, and I enjoyed it. I'm glad to get the chance to do it again, Philip.
Yeah, and I am a subscriber to the Troy Trojans Athletics podcast. So you've been doing some podcasting as well. For someone that's done radio and now doing podcast, what's the differences for you?
Well, podcast. The best way I can make a comparison is with my brother Mike. Mike is a sports writer for Sports Illustrated, and he's had a lot of features in the actual magazine. Which is really controlled and really tight. You have a certain word count and you have it really tightly edited. But he's also done a lot of things for SI.com, which is long form. You can make it as long as you want to. You can add video, you can add graphs and charts and tables and things like that. A lot of that is a lot like, doing a radio show or a radio interview versus a podcast. With a radio interview, I'm constantly, of course, it's live. I'm constantly looking at the clock. Okay, how much more time do we have left in this segment? Should I take a break and carry over this interview into the next segment, or will I have enough content here to get to the end of the segment? But with a podcast, it's liberating, Philip, because you can do as long as you want to. A lot of times the podcast guest, and this, has more leeway to expand upon their answers instead of just 15, 20, 30-second sound bites. So podcasts are a little bit deeper. They got a little bit more depth to them, can be a little bit more illustrative, where a lot of times the real value of a live radio interview is just that, because it's live and you get to hear it right then. A podcast, you can spend a little time and reflect and tell a story and stuff. I like both mediums, but the podcasting, I've really kind of gotten a rhythm to that, and it's a lot of fun to do.
Yeah, I've done a little bit radio, not as much as the podcast, but I do know what you mean, because when I did do kind of filled in when we had ESPN Dothan and here in Dothan, I filled in a time or two, and then I was when you're used to being a podcaster, and then your producer's telling you got to wrap it up, it up. I'm like,
when he gives you this, and you're like, I've just gotten started. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
But it is I love both mediums, so they're both a lot of fun. But for you, doing sports talk every day during a time when we haven't had sports really since March, how has that been? How's it been putting a show and doing a show every day?
Well, it's the first little while of it, and we were on the air on location on that day. I think it was March 12th, when you'll remember, Philip, the Ivy League basketball tournament got canceled, and then later on the SEC tournament and the ACC tournament, and then later on that same day the NCAA tournament got canceled. And you didn't know what in the world was going to happen, how deep this was going to go, how long this was going to last. We still don't know. And you figured that that's enough content right there to get you through a few weeks, maybe. And I have a co-host, and we play off of each other very well. His name is John Longshore, and we're very, very different. So you figure that you're good for a little while, but it's 3 hours every day, 15 hours a week, every week. It's been going on now for almost 4 months. You don't have baseball games to talk about. You don't have college baseball to talk about. You don't have spring football. You don't have Major League Baseball, any of that. So it's becoming a lot less of, hey, these are the scores from last night. This is what happened in this game. This is why so-and-so is really not working out for the money that he got for whomever, for the Yankees or for the Pirates. This is a kid who really looked good in spring football practice. Watch for him in the fall. You don't really have actual activity you can comment on, so it becomes a lot more feature driven. And a lot of radio shows are having a difficult time with that. I'm fortunate because we have, we're a two-man crew, we're a two-man show, and you can play off of each other. We'll spend a lot of time talking about, well, covering the pandemic, of course, what's going to happen when the Ivy League makes their decision on what they're going to do. Is there a domino effect? So you talk more about issues and maybe some more personalities. And it's been interesting because we're also mixing in, summer vacations. I have a very limited time in which I can take a vacation. There's been some furloughs and stuff. I'm soloing my radio show this week. So, there's been peaks and valleys, but there has also been for us, and we're very fortunate about this, not a whole lot of struggle time. We've
Mhm.
always, it seemed, been able to fill that time. Now, it can't go on indefinitely. Sooner or later, we're going to have games. But as of right now, it's been feature driven. It's been entertainment driven, and so far, so good.
Yeah, that's I even have people me ask, you do a sports podcast, what are you talking about? Like, lots of people that are. I said, well, I have to assume there's going to be a football season. That's what I've been doing,
Right.
uh, and just preview teams and just you just hope and have that. I'm an optimist without everything. Just
Hmm.
I've stood by. Said they're coming back. They're coming back. But you're right. It is more kind of not like I said. You can't break down games, but maybe look ahead and then, like you said,
Right.
features on these teams.
And just very opinion driven as always. I tend to believe, and I've been doing this radio show with John for 23 years now. I tend to believe that a lot of times, as a sports talk host or as a podcast host, you can lose your listenership and viewership if you get too involved in breaking down games. I've watched NFL games where the NFL analyst will talk about how the defensive back was late rotating over in the Tampa 2 coverage and the quarterback looked off the tight end. And I guarantee you, 80% of the people viewing it have no idea what they were just talking about. So there's always been a fine line about getting too technical and getting too X's and O's and losing your base sports audience who, looks at it as just entertainment and a fascinating, you know, uh, pastime.
Mm.
But lately it's been really magnified because even if you wanted to overanalyze a game, there's no game to overanalyze.
There's not, and like I said, I'm really just hopeful we
Oh
can
yeah.
get them back and have the actual games to talk about again, and that is going to be, I think, when hopefully it does happen with baseball and the NBA and
Hmm.
football right around the corner when they do come back. I think that's going to be a great thing for everybody because I think that's going to be it's going to be an exciting time. Even if we can't go to the games, just being able to, even if you have to watch them at home, just sitting at home watching them, that's just going to be a big thing I think for most people in the country.
Well, it's not, it's not the most important thing in our world right
Yeah.
now. It's not the most important thing out there, but sports unifies us. Sports
Mhm.
gives us a commonality just across the country. People like sports. It's a way to escape. It's a way to connect with your dad or connect with your uncles when they
Mhm.
come over. So it's not hypercritical, but it is, I think, a unifying force in the country. Now, again, I am absolutely like you, very positive that it's going to come back sooner rather than later. If I'm over in my office in the field house over in the Troy Athletic Department, it is different because people aren't milling around each other. There's
Mhm.
not the same energy necessarily. There's a lot of it, but not the same as it used to be. We're all wearing masks and all that. But everybody there is positive. Troy is selling tickets. They are anticipating every game played at the time it's scheduled. They're making arrangements for, if you have to have a certain percentage of the crowd, if you have to have a certain percentage of the concessions closed and a certain percent of the access points closed. There's all these contingency plans. Nobody knows exactly what it's going to look like. Nobody knows how exactly it's going to happen. But all you can do is plan as though everything is full go until somebody tells you that it's not. And when it's not, or if it's not, then you have other secondary plans in place. But right now, you've got to approach this from a sports viewpoint as though, by gosh, we're selling tickets, we're gonna be ready. until somebody tells you that you're not, and then you can shift on the fly.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting, and I'm just oh, we're waiting to say, hey, we'll go ahead, let's go. So
Right.
let's get
Hmm.
going. But I also wanted to, I'm glad to have you on again because talk about your career a little bit as well.
Hmm.
And I guess my starting point with that is just how did you get started with broadcasting?
Well, it's kind of a layered thing, like everybody. When I went to college, and I went to college at the University of Florida, and I transferred to Auburn. When I went to college, I never took a broadcasting class. I never took a journalism class or anything related to the profession. I majored in liberal arts. I was a political science major. And but beforehand, when I was a little kid growing up in Palm Bay, Florida, my parents, I had the great luck that my parents moved us, my brothers and sisters and me, moved us to a house right across the street from the big athletic complex in Palm Bay. I mean, 30 yards in front of my house was the big baseball field. You had the basketball courts over there. You had the tennis courts across the way. And so I was over there all the time as a little kid. And they'd have little league games and Babe Ruth league games. And I'd play. I always played, but when I wasn't playing, I'd be up there in the little makeshift press box and I'd be doing the public address at 11 or 12 years old, 10, 11, and 12 years old. And I did the public address and I took it seriously. I kept score. I was there early. I made sure I got the pronunciations right. And for that, I got a snow cone at the end of the game. That was what I did. And I thought it was fun. It was just a hobby. My sister Melanie and I used to do a little radio spot on a radio station just outside of Palm Bay about what the goings on at our middle school. So, I mean, I always kind of did that kind of stuff. I never really thought about it as a future, although I loved sports and I always enjoyed talking about it. My like I said, my brother's a sports writer. My dad was a great sports fan. My sisters, but I went to the school at the University of Florida not knowing what I wanted to do. Ended up transferring to Auburn. And one of the reasons why I transferred to Auburn was because I got a job at the commercial radio station in Auburn, WAUD. And for those people who know anything about Auburn or a great deal about Auburn, I got there and I worked with a guy named Bill Cameron, who's still there, does sport. He's the one that hired me. A guy named Paul Ellen was our station manager, and he's with the Auburn Sports Network now. I did an air shift. I played records. I covered city council meetings. I worked weekends. I produced other ball games and everything while I was still a student, just so I could do play by play. And I did play by play with Bill Cameron my very first year in Auburn, which was, 1986 for Auburn baseball. Bo Jackson was on that team. And I thought, but this is great. This is how it is for everybody, right? And we'd go to Georgia, and there'd be people hanging off the roof in Athens, and we'd go to Mississippi State. And my job when Bo was on the team was I was the one who had to go in on the bus trips, and everybody went into McDonald's or something to eat, and I'd have to bring Bo's food out to him in the bus because he couldn't eat in there without a big fuss. And so that was a great start for me. And that was the point when I knew that that's what I ultimately wanted to do. And I did everything they asked me to. I did Auburn High football, Auburn High basketball, Auburn University women's basketball. I did baseball. When I graduated, I helped run the station. I was the program director where I hired a guy named Rod Bramlett. I was the one that brought Rod to Auburn, and it was off and running from then on. I always did a lot of different things in radio. I got a chance to do the talk show in Montgomery, and because of the talk show, I had an opportunity to do some television. And I did a lot of television for Auburn, a lot of television for CSSE, the regional cable TV network. I ended up being their number one guy for about 3 or 4 years, going all over the SEC and all over the Sun Belt and all over the Atlantic Sun Conference doing television. and then had the chance to do some Troy State football TV, and then they hired me to do the radio play-by-play, and I've been doing that now. I've just finished up my 18th year with that, and I still do a lot of ESPN Plus television for Troy, and it kind of started from that. It's just number one, I had the affinity for it, and number two, I was willing to work. I was willing to pay the dues to advance and to get better. And it's thankfully it's all worked out. I've worked with some wonderful people that have helped to make me better. One of my greatest friends in the world is Andy Burcham. He and I did a morning show together at a station in Opelika for 6 or 7 years. When I got to Sports Radio 740, my station in Montgomery, I worked with Jim Fife for 4 years. And you learn from people like that. You'd be an idiot if you didn't try to learn from the people I was surrounded with. I mean, think about it. Paul Ellen and Rod Brownman and Andy Burcham and Jim Fife. Imagine my luck. So, everything I do is, at least in a small part, a bit of a reflection on the people that I've worked with.
Yeah, that sounds like an all-star team right there. Being around all those people, I can't imagine just how awesome that was. And you talked about you've done TV. What's the process difference between doing TV and radio?
The process, the preparation is the same. Mm-hmm. You work hard, and preparation is the key for all of it. I would be horrified if I was forced for some reason to just show up at a venue and call a game without having any idea about any of it. I'd have nightmares about that. So the preparation is the same. You want to find out as much as you can. I have some pretty elaborate spotting charts that I use for football, basketball. As a matter of fact, I've developed my own set. I have them on my website at barrymcknight.com, and I'll go around and I'll see people, for other teams and in other networks, they've got my spotting charts out. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a cottage industry for me. I don't charge for it, but it's always nice to see. But you always try to get as prepared as you can for anything. But in terms of preparation, it's all the same. In terms of the process, it is so much different, because on television, you've got somebody in your ear. Our producer is telling us, replay this, go to break in 10, 9. It's not my production. I'm just following orders and providing captions for the pictures on the TV screen. People can see what's on the screen. You're not as descriptive on television, because they can see that so-and-so is angling right towards the foul line on the dribble, or, the quarterback's rolling right, for instance. So basically what you're doing is embellishing the pictures. You don't have as much responsibility as a play-by-play announcer, except in setting up your color analyst. That's the two main differences between TV and radio. TV is color analyst driven, radio is play-by-play driven. The other one is TV is less descriptive, radio is totally descriptive. On radio, I get to run things. If you hear me on a Troy radio broadcast, I am the one that dictates when we go to break. I'm the one that dictates when we go to the sidelines. I'm the one that lets you know what the score is. I'm the one that takes it to the color analyst, and I'm the goes back to the studio for a scoring update. That is all me. I get to make every one of those decisions. When on television, I don't get to make hardly any of them. And plus, radio, you get to be as descriptive as you want, and that to me is the best part about the business. It's not to the level of being a poet or a sculptor or a painter or something like that, but it's the same mindset. You get to be creative. You get to express yourself. Everybody's different. When you're doing play-by-play, it's going to sound different than when I'm doing play-by-play, and that's a good thing. That's what sells you as a potential candidate for a job over anybody else, is because they can't be Phillip Jordan. They can't be Barry McKnight. Only thing I've got to sell is my perceptions of what's going on in the game and my expression of what's going on in the game. So In terms of the process, it is absolutely different. I enjoy radio more just simply because I have more control and I have more expressive opportunities. But television is obviously, it pays better, there's more exposure, and you still get to go to the game for free. So, which is always a plus for me.
Yeah, that's I joke with people when I started doing games with ESPN Dothan, doing Dothan Tigers football. I used
Hmm.
to joke that I like going to the games, but now I'm just a producer in the studio now for Dothan Wolves. But so
Right,
it is fun being part. It is fun to me. It is always exciting being part of the process on the day of a game, the night before, getting ready. Even on my end, I'm not there calling it with the guys, but I still
right.
prepare as if I am. So I know what's going on, what they're talking about. But it's to me, it's an exciting feeling, for Fridays. You know there's a game. You know you're going to be on the radio that night. You're going to try to put out the best product you can. It's
Right.
exciting on game day when you get to do it.
Yes, and for me, I've done everything from high school football, private school football on top of a bathroom roof, at a small field, and I've broadcast from Ohio Stadium, at Ohio State and LSU and um, University of Georgia, all of these great places, and to me, the feeling that here I am. There is every time before we go on the air, my color analyst Jerry Miller, always before we go on the air, I'll always ask him. It's kind of a tradition. Jerry, is there any place you'd rather be than right here, right now? And he'd said, no doubt about it, and we'd go. It's that same feeling, no matter what level you're broadcasting, what game it is, if it's going to be a great game or if it's a non-region game against somebody that you're expected to win by 40. There's always at least a little sense of, okay, here we go. This is going to be interesting. How do I translate that so that it's interesting for my listenership and my viewership?
I know you mentioned some of the places you've been to, and it kind of piggybacks on something I said earlier about podcasting because I recently went back and I listened to the podcast for the Trojans knocking off the big boys.
Yes.
That looking back, and I was going to ask you about one of those games, and the one I would say I was going to ask you about just the Missouri game,
Mm-hmm.
how big that was for Troy with Larry Blakeney a few years in as a, you know, now we would call an FBS school, moving into that division, just on ESPN at home, Missouri coming to Troy. Just, if you could remember back to that, how big was that for Troy?
Well, for a lot of different reasons, the anticipation of it. It was in 2004, which was my third season doing radio play-by-play. I coupled that with 2 seasons doing television for Troy for the home games. I had seen Troy just in that 5-year period grow so much, from the Southland Football League packages I used to do at old Veterans Memorial Stadium before they had, really anything over there against McNeese State and Nichols and Northwestern State to, my first year, my first game I did as the radio play-by-play voice at Troy was at Nebraska. And I had just gotten the job like 2.5 weeks before, here, jump right in the pool. But it was always these little incremental, small steps of progress, to get to 1A, and then to be competitive in 1A and to try and get a Power Five school to come to Troy was the next step in the progression to try to get an ESPN network to come to Troy and do a game. So the Missouri game was all of that in 2004. You had ESPN2 coming in, Mike Tirico and Kirk Herbstreit and Lee Corso were in the booth right next to me. It was a Thursday night. It was Missouri, which at the time I was number 15 in the country with a Heisman Trophy candidate, Brad Smith. And we'd been making all of these small little incremental steps forward. Well, this, if it broke right, was going to be a huge step forward for Troy if they could pull it off. And if people remember, it didn't look like it was going to happen. Troy got down 14-0, and it didn't look as though Missouri was even breaking a sweat. They scored touchdowns on long drives in their first 2 possessions and weren't even really weren't even really slowed down. But then Vic Koenig, who was the D coordinator then, made a couple of adjustments and shut them down. I mean, they scored 14 points in the first half of the quarter, and they didn't score the rest of the game. And you know, when they got to be 14-0, I told our color analyst, I told Jerry and them, I said, boys, we're going to have to make sure we have some filler material at the end because this one may get away from us here. We got to be ready for whatever. And then, you know, we got the touchdown. DeWitt Betterson fumbles right into the air, and Junior Lewis Saint, who now rooms with me on the road during football games, he's our sideline analyst. You know, we go out to eat all the time and everything, and people ask him about that even now. Picked it up in midair. You could not have reached over and handed the ball to Junior any more cleanly than it just fell into his hands in a full stride, and he goes 70-something yards for the touchdown. And that really kind of lit the candle. The defense held up. And in the second half, the broadcast, which early on had been really skewed towards, boy, Missouri's looking really good. Brad Smith is, you know, making all the plays. He's making all the checks that he needs to. They look very comfortable. So all of a sudden you could hear Herb Street and you could hear Corso say, man, I'm telling you, this Troy, they're doing a lot of things well. They're handling their business. And at the very end, you know, a long touchdown pass from Aaron Leak to Jason Samples in the end zone. And that was, you know, you get up 24-14 at that time. And from then on, Phillip, I promise you, I was calling the play, look at the clock. Call the play, look at the clock. Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. And it finally ticked down. And the ending play-by-play call of that one was, you know, something along the lines of, it's 9:22 and Troy, Alabama, and Veterans Memorial Stadium is absolutely bonkers. And it was one of the first times that I ever really kind of got totally caught up in the moment. As a play-by-play guy, especially, you know, at my level where I'm dictating everything, we let it run for a good long while just for the crowd noise and all that. And I totally forgot when I had to take the commercial break. Was it a network break or was it a break for our local stations? I had totally lost all that just because I had gotten so excited about it. You can't really tell it on the air, but I'm, you know, we were talking about and Jerry was filling, and I'm looking around for my format saying, is this a network break or a local break? And we finally got it out there. And afterwards, you know, the next day I did my radio show and everybody was talking about Troy football. And the ESPN radio hosts were talking about big upset last night in college football in the Thursday night game. Troy upends number 15 Missouri. And for, you know, a certain period of time, that huge leap forward for Troy football was really the biggest leap that Troy made for several years. The next week, Troy goes and they lose at New Mexico State and gave away some of that momentum. But for years and years, when I go around doing football, basketball, and baseball, people would say, yeah, you're from Troy. You guys beat Missouri that night. I watched that game. And that type of exposure is I mean, you can't put a price on it. It certainly would cost a ton of money if you tried.
Yeah, and it kind of like set the stage, I guess, for the future of Troy. They're looked at as the giant killers. I mean, they have gone into some big hostile environments, like, you know, LSU a couple years ago, Nebraska.
Yep.
I know in the podcast, Oklahoma State beating them. It's, Troy's a team that are not intimidated. Under Larry Blakeney, Neil Brown, I think Chip Lindsey the same way.
Right.
It's really something. Troy, they've got that label on them. They'll get you. They'll get you.
And it's good to have that reputation. Sports Illustrated did a piece after the Nebraska win 2 years ago, a feature piece in Sports Illustrated. You know, they were embedded into the program, and they commented so much on that particular phenomenon that, you know, Troy is a giant killer. Troy is not intimidated by anybody. And it's something that, you know, the fans can believe. And it's something that the media can believe, but it's also, I mean, it's great value for the players. On the, you know, we are Troy. You know, after the Nebraska game, Neil Brown said, you know, it's not the same old Troy that's rolling in here. You know, we can win these games. I got in a little bit of hot water in Baton Rouge when we came in the day of the LSU game in 2017. I was a guest we were riding into the stadium, and I was a guest on my phone in the passenger seat with a radio station in Baton Rouge, one of their pregame shows, with a guy named Herb Tyler, who used to be the quarterback at LSU, and another guy. And they asked, well, realistically, Barry, what do you think? What are the expectations for Troy in this game? And I said, fellas, you're asking the wrong guy if you think the answer is going to be anything other than the expectation is for us to win. I haven't gone to a game yet covering Troy where the expectation is for Troy to do anything other than play well and win the football game. And, I caught a little grief for that. I mean, oh, Colin, you can't really believe that. I said, it's just an expectation. It's like we were talking about before. Until somebody proves it otherwise, my expectation is win the football game. And of course, one of the great experiences of that, besides calling the game and, seeing my wife afterwards and seeing all those Troy fans afterwards, one of the great, great memories I have of that was us driving back. We drove back to Troy that night, me and Jerry and Bob, our spotter, and Chris Blackshear, who at the time was our sideline reporter. And they could not wait to get in the car and listen to those LSU radio postgame shows and listen to all of those people talking. They thought that, the world had just fallen down because not only did Troy win the game, but Troy controlled that game. Troy never trailed in it. LSU didn't score in the first half. So it was not as though they could ease their feelings by saying, well, it was a fluke. If they had, if we had done this, we would have won. It was not a fluke out there. And I will say this, I do think that this is one of the catalysts for 2 years later, LSU winning the national championship. I think Ogeron, boy, they were calling him a lot of names that night after the game.
I remember.
And there were some changes, you'll remember. Matt Canada was the offensive coordinator. He was not the offensive coordinator for very much longer. They made some different changes schematically and stuff like that just because I think of that Troy game and them getting out coached in that game.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember just watching that, and it was the Trojans went into the Death Valley, and they always say dreams go to die at Death Valley. But I think Troy made sure LSU's dreams died on that evening.
Well, it was a perfect storm because you remember Darius Geis for LSU, the running back, didn't play in that game. They had gone in with the game plan that they were going to keep it vanilla. They had an SEC game the next week. They weren't going to show too much on film, for anybody else who was looking at it. So they were hoping to beat Troy just playing base offense, base defense. They didn't have their best player on offense. Danny Etling, the quarterback, was injured, was not full strength and all that. But, you look at LSU's program and the resources they have, and you look at the program and the resources that we work with. And even with all that being said, there was really no way that LSU should have lost that game, especially the nature in which they did, which was to get, which was to get beaten up pretty good and be controlled like they were.
It was definitely, and I got two more questions for you.
Okay.
Yeah, over 30 minutes, so I want to just got two more things for you one question, then we'll get to your thoughts on the upcoming season for Troy. But I got to ask for everybody out there, of course, the touchdown men of Troy, just the origins of that.
Well, I never was one for a catchphrase. I think that kind of thing is overrated, particularly when it doesn't sound natural. But for me, I always got so used to Jim Fife. And, like I said, Jim and I worked together for 4 years. I knew of him well in advance and had always, enjoyed his work. I got to, view him in the booth several times, got to work with him. And, he'd always, when I was in the booth and he'd yell, touchdown Auburn, the way he did, it was interesting because you hear it on the radio and it's just so effusive and so enthusiastic. But when you see him do it in the booth, he's very controlled. He's writing down something. He's getting ready for who's coming in for the extra point and all that kind of stuff. So, his voice is tremendously enthusiastic, but he's controlled, in real life up in the booth. And that's one of the things that if I ever got too enthusiastic, like I mentioned at the Missouri game, I don't want to lose my place on where I'm doing and where I'm going and what I'm doing. So I always thought that if it was something organic, like touchdown Auburn, something like that, I'd consider it, but it'd have to be something that's not scripted, that I haven't thought about beforehand. Um, when I first started, my first year doing play-by-play for Troy, it was actually Troy State.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually one time said, touchdown men of Troy State. That's 2 extra syllables. That doesn't exactly flow, and I didn't like it. And so that was just, again, it was organic, just off the top of my head. And a couple of years later, the first game of 2004, I believe, the first year when Troy was officially named Troy University, first game of the year, it just popped out. It's touchdown men of Troy. And Jerry looked over at me. He said, that sounded pretty good. He said, I kind of like that. And my cell phone started buzzing. And the next week, people were telling me, man, I like that. I did it a few more times during that game. As a matter of fact, I did it every time Troy scored a touchdown in that game. And the response was totally positive. They liked it. It wasn't overblown or overdone. And so I've done it ever since. My license plate, if you ever see me out and about, my license plate is a Troy license plate, and it says TDMOT, and everybody asks what it stands for, and it stands for Touchdown Men of Troy. It's become associated with me, and people ask me all the time, hey, can you just give us one of those, when I'm in a speaking engagement or in a class or something like that. And I'll never say it unless we've just scored one. You don't want to waste those.
There you go. So they got to listen on Saturdays to hear when the
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
To hear. There you go.
Yeah.
And finally, just looking at this upcoming season for Troy, and obviously last season, didn't go the way he wanted, didn't get to a bowl game. Offensively, they were really good last year. Of course, you got to replace Caleb Barker, who had a tremendous year, but plenty of talent around him coming back at receiver, running back, all over the place. Of course, defensively, I know last year was issue with injuries and stuff really hit Troy hard. Just overall, what are your feelings going into the 2020 season for the Troy Trojans?
I see so much talent. Part of me selfishly wants to have this full season as scheduled, not postponed, all 12 games because of Chip, because of Coach Lindsey. Mm-hmm. He is such a good guy to work with, and he has such a vision and such an aptitude for offensive football and running a program and recruiting and all of that. And my gosh, there's a lot of talent. The question marks on offense, you mentioned quarterback. There's a couple of guys that have that look. Gunnar Watson, who was the backup to Caleb last year, I really like him. Parker McNeil, who was the junior college player of the year last year, and Jacob Free from over in Brantley, the high school, the Vanderbilt transfer. You could win with all of those guys. The offensive line, you lose a lot of good guys. You lose Deontay Crumity in the middle. You lose Kurt Kelly, and you lose Crowder and some of the other guys up there that are, that were 2 and 3 year starters. But you got Austin Stidham back at one tackle position, and they recruited really well on the line. And then you get to the other skill positions. My gosh, running back is loaded at Troy. And I would say that even if I wasn't associated with him. B.J. Smith, who was the preseason player of the year last year and barely played, he is back. D.K. Billingsley, who ran for almost 1,000 last year, he is back. You got a guy like Charles Strong, a transfer from Texas A&M, big, strong back. Jamontez Woods. You got, I know I'm going to leave somebody out, but you've got a freshman kid they really like named Kamani Vital. Wide receivers. Reggie Todd is back. Khalil McLean is back. Kalen Geiger was an absolute gem, a real find last year. A couple of good guys there. So offensively, my gosh, I think it's going to be fantastic. Defensively, I think the key is going to be health. Mm-hmm. Finally got some guys that weren't available last year coming back. The cornerbacks, Terrence Dunlap, and there's another really good one named Monte McGarry that is going to be really good. One of the young safeties, Del Pettis, was a freshman All-American. The defensive line is anchored by Will Cholo. I love him. John is another guy who's going to be really good. And of course, you got Carlton Marshall at middle linebacker, along with KJ Robertson. Carlton Marshall is one of my favorite players I've ever seen at Troy. You look at him and think, somebody probably needs to tell him he shouldn't be doing the things that he's doing. I told him before, I said, Carlton, you're a challenge to broadcast because I've got to keep coming up with different ways to say Marshall makes the tackle because he makes almost every tackle. It's been fun to watch him progress. Defensively, there's more depth. Last year there was hardly any. So I think defense will be vastly better. And by the way, one more defensive note: there's a bandit that they really like, a transfer from Auburn named Richard Jibunor, who boy he looks good coming off the bus as well. I see great things if we're able to play, and I hope so.
And I do too. I really do. I hope that we're there because I'll try to go to one or two Troy games in person every year. That is the goal. I went to the South Alabama game last year. I had a ball. It's always a good time to go and see the Trojans play in Troy. And Barry, I've kept you right at 40 minutes. I hope I have not kept you too long.
No, this has been great
today. And
this
I do
has been
appreciate
great.
You taking the time. If the listeners wanted to follow you online, and the viewers, I got to remember to say viewers now, not just listeners.
That's right.
The viewers too. If they want to follow you online, where can they find you?
Well, the best place on social media is just on Twitter. It's just simply at Barry McKnight, BarryMcKnight. If you want to look on my website if some of you are aspiring broadcasters and want to check out my spotting charts and my depth charts and my scorecards and all that kind of stuff, that's at barrymcknight.com. Usually the Twitter account's the best way to get updates and broadcast links and time changes with Troy. And of course, stuff having to do with my morning show, which you can listen to online at sportsradio740.com.
That sounds good, Barry. And I know there's a big gap between when I last had you on the podcast and now. I promise not to wait that long again to ask you again, but I do hope maybe we can do this again sometime down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming up this fall, if we're playing football and you've got a chance for a home game, we'll get you set up. You can come sit up in the booth with us and we can talk a little football then too.
I appreciate it, Barry. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.